welcome back. Today, it is my pleasure and honor to have Dr. Jake Thibault with us. He is a professor, and I'll tell you guys a little bit about him in just a moment. But I wanted to thank Dr. Thibault for being here with us. Thank you for making the time.
Well, thank you, Ramon. It's wonderful to be here.
Awesome. And by the way, well, let's go ahead and get started with the introduction and we'll jump into some other things. But so for everyone's, so that everyone knows who you are, I'd like to go ahead and just give a quick introduction. So Dr. Thibault is a professor of philosophy and law at St. Joseph's College in Maine. He was an attorney for the Office of Legal Aid and Detention for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That's going to be fascinating to discuss.
It's a mouthful, isn't it?
It is. You're a published author, right? One of your books is called Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria, a Catholic Response. And then you also have two children's books. The first one is called It's Fun to Be a Nun. And then your second book is called Discover the Brothers. You're the chair of the anthropology team at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops at Catechetical Institute. You're a lawyer for the United Nations in the Hague. You're the head of the Pierre Toussaint Society. You actively are actively involved in raising money, right, for scholarships for children in Haiti. And at the end of the podcast, we'll go ahead and share your information so that if anybody's interested in supporting this cause, they can do so. You're also actively involved in building a school in on Segele. And you're also you've helped bring about some reform in Rhode Island for parolees. Is that all accurate?
It's all accurate.
Perfect. Okay, just wanted to make sure. So awesome. So Dr. Thibault, is it okay if during the podcast if I call you Jake? Is that okay?
Certainly, yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, Jake, let's jump into this. You have an interesting life. I mentioned that to you before, right? I think it's fascinating. Your background is absolutely fascinating. So I'd like to go ahead and start though first, just if you could tell us a little bit about where you grew up and where you grew up and a little bit about your background.
Sure. I grew up outside of Providence, Rhode Island, in a small town, and went to Stonehill College for, I thought I was going to be a doctor, but I don't know, the religious bug hit me, and I decided to enter religious life to become a religious brother. Um, uh, Over discernment, I wanted to do more work with marginalized people, so I ended up leaving the brothers. Um, and then strange turns of events, I ended up with degrees in theology and then law and business and now a PhD. So I've had my hands in many things over the years, but at one point, I was studying at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, and we would always joke we'll either all become priests or lawyers. And I ended up going the lawyer route because Thomas Aquinas is very logical and systematic. That's how I ended up where I ended up.
So there's a lot of interesting things, twists and turns, right, in your life right there. Maybe if we could start off with, let's start off with the fact that you said that the decision to become a lawyer. How did that come about?
Well, I think my mother was working at a law school, and I thought I just can't go into theology. I already have a degree. I'm going to go into so much debt. I need to do something practical with my life. And I called my mother and I said, "What do you think about me going to law school?" And she said, "Well, the semester's starting pretty soon." And she said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, can you call in a favor?" And she said, "I'll see what I can do." And she called in some favors to try to get me into the law school where she was working. But came at a bit of a risk to her career because what if I was a terrible law student? It would reflect on her. But thankfully, at the end of the first semester, I had the highest GPA in the law school. So it turned out to be a benefit to that I was there. So uh, I think about halfway through, I thought, I'm not sure I really want to be a lawyer, though. So I'm glad
Yeah.
to be teaching law now, but I'm kind of glad I'm not a practicing attorney at this point.
Yeah. How old were you when you decided to become an attorney? 'Cause-
27. Yeah, and then it takes about 3 years. So I graduated at 30.
Yeah. And then just out of curiosity, like you said, it's about halfway through you thought maybe I don't want to be an attorney. What was it that that led to that, that internal reflection of questioning yourself?
Well, I got into to the profession. I thought I wanted to help people. And I knew wonderful priests in my life that were lawyers and priests, and they really helped the community. And I thought that's the area I want to get into. The more time I spent in law school, the more the people who came up to me to ask me for help were people who had disputes with their brother or sister, and now they want to sue their sister. And I thought, I'm not interested in suing people. People like I'd be more happy to help you sit down and talk with your sister than sue your sister. It seemed like uh some of the area was going it was difficult. Some of the law that I loved though was I worked for Rhode Island Legal Services, which helps a lot of low income people. I know you're very interested in that type of work too, the people who can't afford a lawyer. And I
Yeah.
was in the housing unit during the Great Recession. So there was a lot of great work that we were doing there, but there's not a lot of funding for legal help for poor people. There's just they're always losing attorneys, and the funding just disappears from one administration to the next. So unfortunately, I couldn't do that type of work. So the type of work I would have to get into would either be for profit or starting my own business. And I thought, I'm not ambitious enough, because when you do that type of work, you have to take whatever case that comes, whoever's willing to pay. And I just don't have the constitution to be type of suing people for things that I'm not fully behind. So I thought, I'm not sure this is the profession that I wanted to get into after all.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of wonderful stuff that lawyers do, but there's also some, grunt work to get there.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's funny, right before the podcast, we were talking, right? And I was telling you about how I want to do all these wonderful things. But the difficult part, right? And just so that everybody understands, it's like even if you're an attorney and you have good intentions and you want to do well, do good, right, for your local community or for just the society as a whole or for the world, if you have a bigger vision, right, is that you also got to make a living, right? You got to be able to pay the rent. You got to be able to support your family, and that's the tough part. And the cool thing for us, just a quick little thought here, a little tangent, but it's one of the reasons I'm doing a number of other projects is because success in some of these other projects will allow me to be able to be incredibly generous and helping out, right? People that cannot afford, right? Just the services of an attorney, right? Because it's so
Right.
expensive.
And you need a team. You really can't to be an attorney alone is very, very difficult. You really need a team of people who have the same vision that you're working with and that you can support one another. Really important.
Yeah. So how long did you practice law before switching, making the next switch or the next turn in your life, in your career?
Well, I worked for at legal services for a few months, mostly volunteering. I wasn't getting paid very, very much to do that work at legal services, but I would have about 100 clients a day, which is a lot of clients in one day. But and then I was at the ICTY, the Tribunal for the Yugoslavian Genocide. I was there for 6 months. Usually, people came in for short periods of time to just work on a case, and then they were out. And then after that, I did some consulting work for Open Doors, which dealt with uh, parole reform and criminal justice reform in the state of Rhode Island, mostly volunteering. Uh, so I never hung up my shingle and started my own practice or anything. I just mostly assisted others who were doing it. Uh, Teaching was much better fitting for me. It was a much better fit.
Yeah. And by the way, during those first few years when you were, taking on about 100 clients a day and helping people out, right, for free, are there any stories that stand out? Maybe, something that you're able to share that you can share with us, maybe of an injustice that you helped correct or, where you were able to really have a huge impact on somebody. And I'm sure there's 100 of those, but maybe if you had one or two of those.
Yeah, yeah. One of the big issues that we were dealing with, you know, eh, some of this is people get ideas in their minds and they don't understand the complexity of these situations. And one of them was we had a lot of tenants in very poor areas who they would move into an apartment, they would pay their landlord first month rent, deposit, all the upfront costs, but the landlord was being foreclosed on, and he didn't tell the clients. So he collected all of the rent money for the whole building of people and all the deposits. And then within a month, the bank would be there to lock them out. And they've lost their deposit, they lost their rent, they lost everything they've given this guy. So then they're evicted, right? And who can afford to lose 3 months rent, right? When you consider first, last deposits and everything. And then they'd move into another apartment, pay all this money up front again, and the bank would foreclose on them 2 months into it. And now they're out all that money. And a lot of people were blaming the tenants, saying these, slum tenants that aren't paying their rent, now they're complaining. And it wasn't that situation at all. A lot of times these tenants had paid 3 months rent for less than 1 month of rent before they were evicted by the bank. So we worked on a lot of legislation to try to freeze that, so that if you had a lease, the bank had to now become your landlord. You didn't get anything for free, but the bank had to honor the lease that you had, which was very important. And we got that legislation passed, and thankfully Obama passed a national legislation to protect tenants that way as well, which of course can get taken advantage of it by the other side as well, people with fake leases and things like that. There's no perfect system, but the system at the time was very harshly swayed against tenants, especially very honest tenants who are just trying to survive in the very poor areas.
Right. I love that. I didn't know that you were, that you were a significant, like a mover and shaker, right, in that direction to get that legislation passed. But I knew about that legislation because, so I also work in real estate, right, and in all aspects of real estate, and multifamily is one of those. And I knew about that law, and it's awesome. It's an honor, no, to be able to meet somebody who was actually behind that movement. I'm sure there was a lot of other people involved, but your contribution and your successes, I'm sure, were significant in getting that legislation passed to protect lower income families that get taken advantage of in that way.
Yeah, yeah. I'm no major player in it, but it was kind of our voice to take these peoples and take their story and kind of elevate them to the public sphere. So people, instead of just hearing people ripping the tenants apart, saying, these are just slum people who don't pay their rent, right? It's more complicated than that, right? Some of some people couldn't pay their rent who didn't pay their rent because we were in the middle of a recession, right? These were complicated times, but we tried to restore the humanity to the situation. Yeah. But
Yeah.
we with 100 cases, not all 100 cases a day were like that. A number of cases were people not paying their rent, but then calling us saying, you know, I want to stay in the apartment for another 3 months. And you say, well, when was the last time you paid rent? Well, about 3 months ago. And you say, well, I get, I understand, but you do have to pay your rent, right? So sometimes the legal advice is you either have to pay your rent or move on as well, right? Because there has to be justice both for landlords and for tenants. But that's why it's useful to have someone like Rhode Island Legal Services to kind of give that advice to um, people of, well, what is the law? What is justice in this situation? Because a lot of times, if people just talk to their friends tell them that they're 100% right, and they should never have to pay rent again, right? But sometimes, if you don't have the legal services, then landlords could become somewhat abusive over their tenants not maintaining buildings, and there could be problems both ways, right? So you really do need lawyers to help balance justice, and it's always a matter of trying to get it right.
Yeah, and it's difficult. And it's difficult because, like you mentioned earlier, there's always people that will try to take advantage of it, right? Even if you come up with the perfect solution, somebody, and it's the outliers, right? Most people won't do that, but they'll look for a way to be able to get an additional benefit out of, right, the system, try to squeeze the system for as much as possible to get an unfair advantage or an unfair, yeah, benefit of some sort. So Yeah.
Yeah, whenever there's an ability to manipulate the system, whether it's the landlord or it's the tenant or wherever it is, there's always going to be that challenge. But you really just have to try to be level-headed, listen, help people communicate their points, kind of echo it back to them what they're saying, and try to get rational minds to get ahead. Luckily, Rhode Island in the legal courts is not overly biased towards tenants or landlords. I think it's a fairly balanced state in that regard.
Nice. Cool.
Mm.
So Jake, if you don't mind, if I wanted to jump into your experience in
Yeah.
Yugoslavia as an attorney involved in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, could you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, that right there is fascinating. For years I had heard about that. When I was going through USC, I knew some people from Yugoslavia, and they were the ones that educated me for the first time ever about what was going on down there. But I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, yeah. My law school that I went to, Southern New England School of Law, which has now been incorporated into the UMass law system, had a very strong relationship with the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the Yugoslavian Genocide. And so a lot of times, as soon as we were getting done with law school, we could get an in to get some experience. It looks good on your resume. You get to do international law, which was an exciting thing. So the court itself was in The Hague, which is in the Netherlands. So the trial itself wasn't in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. Um, but it was it's amazing to be walking into work every day and you have NPR vans out front covering the cases. Um, but it was really a heartbreaking time. We had in the Office of Legal Aid and Detention, where I was, one of the attorneys had up on his wall all this property that a lot of the leaders of the genocide had collected: houses and boats and yachts and cars, just massive amounts. And his job was to find where they were hiding all their assets. And he had a little sign above it that said "Crime Pays," um, which he was forced to take down at some point. Um, but when I was there, we were dealing with Karadzic, who was one of the leaders of the Srebrenica genocide, which took the lives of over 8,000 unarmed young men and children, males. Um, and it was as much as we were aiming for justice, it seemed like there was so much injustice in the whole scenario and in the whole process. Um, we'd have women come and testify that they were sexually assaulted right after their husbands or their boyfriends or their fathers were murdered in front of them. Right? Absolute horror. And they're living back in Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, and there's a lot of threats of violence against them because the foot soldiers who did this are still there. There's the ICTY, put 200 people on trial, but not every foot soldier, right? So the people who had performed a lot of these atrocities were still there. They're physically there. So there were threats of violence against them if they were to testify in court. So it was a tremendous act of bravery to be able to testify against the people who killed your family and have sexually abused you, sometimes multiple times. Um, and then there's a bit of the injustice in the entire system too, because many people like Karadzic, they were self-represented, where they would antagonize the witnesses and try to make a mockery out of the court, which was just hard thing too, to be a victim of this and to be made fun of to your face by the person who is ultimately responsible for this genocide. And then if they were person were finally found guilty, which most of them were, because again, we weren't trying foot soldiers, we were trying generals and presidents and the leaders of the genocide,
Right.
which is pretty well documented what they had done. They might be found guilty, right? Guilty of genocide, which if you're in America, you would, you could end up in jail for a long time for very small things, right? In America, right? this is Europe though, right? And this is Europe. So there is no death penalty in Europe. So the worst sentence you could get would be life imprisonment in Europe. And only the countries that have signed on to these UN agreements would be the prisons that you would be sent to, which are mostly Germany or France or Norway, places like that in Europe. A life sentence in most European countries is 25 years max. That's a life sentence, is 25 years. Any time during the trial counts as time served. Usually trials are about 5 years. So now, guilty of genocide, 20 years in jail. It goes up to appeal. 5 years more is dropped off in the appeal. Now it's 15 years. In Europe, most European countries, after 2/3 of the sentence is served, they can apply for good behavior and be let out. So some of the people who've been found guilty of genocide, the genocide of 8,000 people, right, might end up with a jail sentence of 9 years.
Wow.
Right. That's it's a and if you were the woman who had to get up and testify and to relive the trauma and to deal with the threats of people in your hometown that might try to kill you for speaking up against what had happened, to then 9 years later be walking down the street and the person who did this to you is free, a free person, free man.
Right. That's
It's
tough.
hard, and these trials cost millions of dollars, right? Millions of dollars to get a genocidal war criminal in jail for 9 years. Um, but part of it is that the ICTY, like all of the UN courts, they don't really have jurisdiction, right? International law is an illusion.
Hmm.
There's no such thing, technically speaking.
Could you
It's
explain that? Yeah, that's fascinating. Could you explain that?
Yeah. So the United States has law, the laws of the United States. We have a constitution, right? We have state laws, we have federal laws. England has constitution, state laws, federal laws. France has it, right? All countries have laws. There is no such thing as an international law, right? There are international guidelines, but there are no such thing as international laws, right? So if an American were to commit a crime in France, they could be uh, held on trial in France. But there is no international law to govern anything, right? So how do we have international law? Because you probably heard the term international law if you're watching, right? It's because different countries can sign on to UN declarations saying things like genocide is a violation of international law, right? So if Germany signs on and France signs on and the United States signs on and UK and it goes on, right? If then Germany commits genocide, well, all of these countries have agreed that we would not do that. So we could, if we come together and we can come into agreement, we could force Germany into our jurisdiction, but it's force because, like, for example, Hitler did not violate any laws, German laws, right?
Right.
Completely law abiding, right? So how do you try Hitler for genocide when he didn't break any German laws, right? This is the challenge, right? This is why the Nuremberg trials were the first of the kind type of international law criminal trials. The second was the ICTY of the Yugoslavian genocide. Right? So we had about 50 years without a genocidal court. Now we have a permanent court set up with the ICC, International Criminal Court. But it's hard to make these laws stick, right? If they're very hard laws, less countries will sign on, right? If they're very strict laws and they hold people to very high standards, you might not want to sign on. So, for example, America does not sign on to nearly any of these agreements, um, partially because, as an example, people were very upset internationally over America's Gulf War, for example, George Bush after 9/11. A lot of people wanted to see George Bush on trial for war crimes. if America were to sign on to these types of agreements, it might put American soldiers on trial at The Hague for war crimes to say, well, look at what they did to the people of Iraq, look what they did to, right? You can go down the list. Um, America will not put itself in the hands of an international court. It will not put its soldiers or its politicians in the hands of an international court. So we don't back it, right? We might financially fund it, but we will not give jurisdiction over ourselves for it. But because of that, we're also not part of the trial, right? In some ways, these genocidal victims, genocidal killers that have been found guilty, it would be wonderful to send them to a federal prison in Nebraska. Instead, they are on the coast of the Netherlands with an ocean view and 9 years in prison. But that's because America has been unwilling to sign on to some of these agreements. So, yeah, international law is a kind of a complicated thing, especially international criminal law.
That's interesting, yeah. And it's funny because one of the things that came to mind as you were explaining this is that I think what was it with Saddam Hussein, right? He was captured and then he was hung, right? And that whole process, right? Everything, the way that he was executed and all that. If we had signed on, that would have never happened, right? He would have had to gone to trial, and it would have been he would have been, sentenced to 9 years, watching the ocean for
Yeah.
9. But
Yeah,
instead,
if he had been brought to The Hague for trial, he would still be alive today, and he would probably be walking free, right? He'd be walking free if he were. Yeah, yeah. The relationship between the U.S. and the UN is a complicated one, right?
it is.
For sure.
Here's an interesting question that I wasn't planning on asking you, but just you mentioned, right, the difference in the sentence exposure and actual time served, right, and the comparison, the European countries versus the U.S. I'd love to get your opinion on this. So on one end, you have somebody who's guilty of genocide, killing 8,000 people, directly or indirectly being involved in killing 8,000 people, innocent, unarmed people, and they do 9 years, right? Yeah, that's insane. And on the other end, you have in the American criminal justice system, you have all of these people that so for example, one of the gentlemen that reached out to us, and this is when I was a partner at a law firm just not too long ago, and then we're setting up our own now. But this was a gentleman that reached out to us, and in his case, he was an 18-year-old kid. He didn't know what was going to happen. They were selling marijuana. Right now, it's legal in a bunch of states. But the point is that he was breaking the law, but one thing led to another, and the guy that he was with, who was much older than him, he might have even been 17. The guy that he was with, that was much older, ended up killing, right, the person on the other side of the transaction.
Mhm.
So now he was sentenced to spend 30 years in prison for being involved in it. Now, what he was doing was the dumb youngster selling drugs, right? He wasn't the
Mhm.
one. He wasn't planning on killing anybody. He didn't know anyone was going to be killed. He was just trying to sell, and he was probably trying to support his own habit, right? As a 17-year-old kid
Mhm.
trying to make some money so he could buy some more pot so he can smoke it himself. And he, like I said, he's sentenced to at least 30 years. Potentially will end up doing more. Potentially, hopefully not. But at this point, it's looking at 30 years. What are your thoughts on that? What would be a balance? What are the factors? I mean, it's a complex issue, right? But I'd love to get your thoughts on
Mhm.
it from whatever angle you want to approach it. I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, yeah. I don't want to open my mouth and just have words come out that are unthoughtful. I really want it to be a thoughtful answer. But yeah, it just seems like crime in a lot of European countries, uh, they just have such a different approach to society in general, but also especially its prison systems in terms of like trying to restore people to society, right? To try to bring people back into community. So we have a lot of stories of Scandinavian countries, right? Where if you're a prisoner, they might let you out to go to work or you can go take a walk outside and they try to rehumanize you because if they want to release you back into society, you don't want to release somebody who you have dehumanized for the last 10 years, right? You want somebody who's more human and more integrated into humanity. Um, America, it would be wonderful to have a Scandinavian system. I'm not sure how we can do it. I'm not sure, and I'm not against the idea, but I think we are dealing with some deep antisocial. There are some deep antisocial movements within America, but it seems like dehumanizing people and then releasing people back into society is not the right answer, right? I'm not sure how long is the right amount of sentence for people to be rehabilitated and for there to be proper justice. Um, but the dehumanizing effect seems to not work, right? So even when I was in The Hague and I would be visiting genocide people who are accused of genocide, um, I had to go to the prison a few times to meet with the accused. Um, it was very different than my experience of going to a minimum security prison in America. The minimum security prison in America was far more dehumanizing. Even getting into the prison, right? I was when I was once a brother and I had a habit on. I nearly was strip searched in order to go visit somebody in a minimum security prison as a visitor, right? At a maximum security prison, right, with war criminals, we kind of just walked in. It was a totally different experience, right? I'm not sure what the answer was. I would love to have a nice clear answer of how America could do it, but I don't know the right answer. I'm hoping that maybe you, with your podcast, you'll come to some good answers. But it seems like whatever we're doing isn't working. But I'm not sure what the answer is. Did you have any insights? What do you think?
Well, and then there's two parts to this, right? Like to, kind of following your string of thought, like there's the actual sentence, right? Sentencing an 18 or 17-year-old to 30 plus years, right? When he really, his participation and his, level of culpability for what happened, right, could arguably be said to be minimal, right? And you've
Mm,
essentially, now you take his life for that long. So there's that component, right? How much time somebody serves, and whether or not that's proportional to what their
mm,
involvement and and then the second component you address is the rehabilitative efforts during that time, right? Or in another way to say it is whether you humanize them and try to make them better, or you dehumanize them and essentially treat them so terrible that that when they're back into society, right, that they have trouble. They have trouble reintegrating back into society because you have a damaged human being, right? And when we
mhm,
were talking before the podcast, we were talking about this thought that I had about how we as human beings are so fragile, and even the person that's had the most coddled life, even those people have issues, right? They have
mm,
trauma, they have things that have happened that have caused injury, and the reason I say that is just because like our psyche is so fragile,
mm,
and if you take somebody that's already got maybe we'll call it a programming error, right? Maybe they have a little bit too much aggression, or maybe they have a tendency to get addicted to things, and they unfortunately get addicted to marijuana, or they get addicted to alcohol, or whatever it is, right? But then you take that person, and instead of trying to fix that one little glitch in them, right? Because they potentially have they have the potential to be great human beings, right? Loving, contributing members of society, great parents, great brothers and sisters, great whatever, right? You just go down the list. But now instead of trying to fix that little glitch in that person, instead you've made them worse because now you've added
mm,
another list of issues that they have. Because once you go into right here in the U.S., you go into the prison system. The system is not designed to make you better. The system is purposely and intentionally designed to really just break you down, and not in a good way, right? Like in the military where they
mhm,
break you down to build you up again. No, they break you down and then they just keep you down there, right? Just um, so it's a complex question, right? There's a lot of the research is out there, right? So I've had a podcast with a gentleman that had tons of information on that, and he says, look, it's if in the U.S. we wanted to start, let's address the second question, right? The latter. So if we wanted to help people reintegrate back into society successfully, it's not rocket science. It's the research is already out there, right? And they
mhm,
already know exactly what needs to be done. but there's got to be the willpower, right? Somebody's got to, people in power have got to get on the same page and go, yeah, let's do that. That's good for society. That's good for humanity. And that hasn't happened. There might be some small exceptions and examples of, prisons or jails, that they're making small steps, right, to that direction. But overall, it's not happening. But any further thoughts on that matter?
Yeah, well, two thoughts. One is there's a wonderful book by Barry Schwartz on practical wisdom where he argues he's an Aristotelian. I'm a bit of an Aristotelian myself, Aristotle, right? That we, as Americans, we love laws and rules. Like we want it to be black and white. We want, we let people go or we lock them up for life. Like we're not good at gray areas. And he argues that what our world needs more now than ever before, especially as Americans, is wisdom, right? We need to have wise judges that can look at every person individually and not how many, okay, this is the fourth time you're before me, so now you're in jail automatically for the next 15 years, right? You got to look at every person's situation, look at the whole, right? The whole person. Is there mental illness? Is there addiction? How is the person raised, right? You look at all of the factors and then determine what is the appropriate response for that person, right? And it's not to be soft because sometimes we can be too universal with softness too, right? Where you have somebody who's mentally ill and attacking people on the streets of New York, and they just let him let the person back free again too, right? That's not wisdom either, right? Wisdom would be seeing the specific person, right? And then um, making appropriate judgments. But a lot of times our legal system is not set up that way, right? It's kind of automatic sentencing, which is not doing justice, right? That's not justice, is automatic sentencing. Um, I know I said there was a second part, and now it's fled my mind what that might
That's
be, but
okay. So I'll give you some thoughts on what you said. And I think you said you listened to some of my content, and one of the things that I bring up, and let me know if you think of the second thing, and we'll stop and
Mhm,
we'll jump to yours. But one of the things that I mentioned in some of the content that I have that most people don't realize, they think, right, that we strive for black and white, right? For sure,
mhm,
that's right, rule of law, so on and so forth. But what most people don't realize, unless they have had experience in the criminal justice system, is that most things in the criminal justice system are not black and white. It's
mhm,
there's so much discretion, right? Judges have so much discretion. Um,
mhm,
you think you have a Fourth Amendment right, right? A Fourth Amendment right that protects you against illegal search and seizure, but it's not that plain and simple. There's exceptions, and it goes down the list. There's probably 20 different exceptions to that. And I say 20, there's probably more than them. Your right to not incriminate yourself, right? The Miranda rights and all of that. That whole body of law, people think that that's black and white. It's not, right? Police are
mhm,
actually trained to purposely circumvent. They're purposely trained to use psychological tactics and ploys to circumvent that. Judges, right? Getting back to your point, judges, wisdom would be so important. Like, how do you test for wisdom, right? But the judges have so much discretion, they can rule any which way they want, and there
mhm,
are almost no consequences. I mean, it'd be incredibly difficult for you to be able to hold the judge accountable when he violates black letter law, right? Something that's
mhm,
fundamental. And it happens. You know what I mean?
mhm,
I talked a little bit about my past. It happened in my case, right? My Miranda rights were violated clearly, based on clearly established law, but he chose to rule that no, you're good. Your statements were obtained legally, and but there's tons of examples like that, right? Tons of
mhm.
them. In my case, and I'm sure there's tons of them, right? Other people listening. So it's wisdom. I love that. I never thought of it that way. Wisdom would definitely solve a lot of those problems. How do you test for it though?
Right, right. Well, we have to select judges who are known for it. Yeah, that would be the key is that you select judges that are known for it. Right. In that book that by Barry Schwartz, he gave an example of a guy who he held up a taxi cab. He was desperate for money. He had nothing. He had a plastic gun. It wasn't a real gun, and he held up um a taxi cab and he got arrested. And the judge saw that this guy, he didn't have a criminal past. He didn't have a violent history. he was a man who was desperate, very desperate. And even with it being a plastic gun, like it wasn't even really a violent moment, although obviously it's the wrong thing to do, right? It wasn't right. And they allowed the person to go and work and come back to jail at night in order so that he could continue to feed and take care of his family, right? But then there's so many systems where it's like that's not acceptable. But it's like that would be the wisdom in that situation, right? Or there was another story of a father who took his kid to a baseball game and the kid wanted lemonade. The father brought back a Mike's Hard Lemonade. He didn't realize it was alcoholic, right? But people saw it, got very upset. It ended up going before a judge, and the child was removed and put into foster care while the father was receiving training on proper parenting. But and I was a foster parent to three children. I believe in foster care, but I also know that if you have a good parent, foster care is not where the kid belongs, right? Um, but the judge tried to be generous, but in the state ended up objecting to it because they said no, there has to be clear rules, and because I'm sure one time a judge was lenient and then something bad happened to the kid. So now they try to create more strict rules to say, no, you have to remove the kid for 6 months, 3 months, and go through a process of getting the kid back, right? But what do we really need in those situations is more wisdom, right? Wisdom is what's needed, not necessarily a black and white rule. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
no,
remember the second point too. I don't know.
what
The
is it?
second point would be, I think partially too, we think of ourselves as very different. We think of ourselves in a certain way that might not be accurate to our true human nature. And this is where my philosophy side comes out, would be,
Love
you
it.
know, when I teach the class on the problem of good and evil, philosophically speaking, we tend to see ourselves as the people who hid Anne Frank. We are Harriet Tubman. We are we are the good ones, right? We are the good ones. But the reality is most of us are more situationally good and bad than we would like to admit, right? When you look at things like the Stanford Prison Project, where they took college students and they made some of them guards and some of them prisoners, it's amazing how quickly the prisoners were dehumanized and accepted their dehumanization, and how quickly the students who were the guards were okay with dehumanizing them. And none of them were prisoners. None of them were guilty of anything, but how quickly they became what they were presented as, right? So you could even see, like, within our own legal system, it's so easy. Like, we could think, like, I would never be a guard that would dehumanize an inmate, or if I were an inmate, I would always maintain my sanity. But it's just so easy within our human nature to fall into these roles and to adapt to it. And that should give us some insight into being more understanding of people. Like, because we really aren't better than the other. We will quickly do that ourselves, right? And hopefully we don't. But like, we probably would, right, if we were put in that situation. I don't know what do you think about that, but
No, I love that. I love what your thought on that. It brings up all kinds of interesting things. One, that comes to mind is, well, two examples that fall under the same thing, right? It's I've met a gentleman not so long ago, and I've actually met several people, but the last one was just recently, who he gave himself up to police, right? He went ahead and said, hey, he had a warrant for his arrest. I don't know the details of what the crime was, and nor does it matter, but he went ahead and followed all directions, went down to the ground, and then once he was on the ground, face down, the police officer released the canine and gave the canine directions or orders to go and attack him.
wow.
And I met the guy personally, right? And the checks and balances are not there, right, to keep that stuff from happening over and over again. I knew of multiple stories, and then I don't watch the news a lot, but recently, even just a couple months back, I think here in Utah, I heard about a case where something similar happened, different person. It went to trial. And it was a judge that decided, if I'm not mistaken, it could have been a jury trial, but they decided that the officer was not guilty, right? He was not guilty of what he was being charged. And you go, how is that possible? They had body cam footage that clearly shows
Mhm.
same situation. Guy says, "Hey, you got me. Sorry." Goes down, whatever, or
Mhm.
doesn't say sorry, whatever. But he goes down, gives himself up, and then they release the canine on him. Or there's another gentleman that about a year and a half ago that came to us, right, with the law firm, and he was police officers in the jail, right? Going back to the
Mhm.
story, people in the jail, they brought him out of his cell for whatever reason. They told him to get down on his knees, put his hands behind his head, right? And then after they handcuffed him, like, and he said, and there was video recordings of this. This is not just a story, right? They kicked him in the face, and they wear boots, right? They're required to all wear
Mhm.
boots, like big steel toe, big giant boots. And they kicked him in the head multiple times after he was handcuffed and he was on the ground. And they got away with
Mhm.
it. They got away with it.
Wow.
They destroyed the video
Wow.
evidence. So there was a camera that was right there because he looked into this and he called us. And then when we went to look for the camera, the video recordings, it was gone. Like they deleted it and
Mhm.
destroyed it. But it's interesting, right? You have to have checks and balances to keep people from being able to take advantage of their power. But getting back to the philosophical human nature side of things, I think you're absolutely right. It'd be interesting to find out, like, um, you know, just a small tangent, right? But like out of everybody out there, right, the 330 million Americans, right? If all the adults, whatever number that is, whether it's 200 million or whatever it is, if everybody, right, was caught for the worst thing that they've ever done, what percentage of our population would be felons? I would argue
Mhm.
that it would be a pretty high percentage because
Yeah, yeah.
we're not as good as we think we are. We're not as
Right.
squeaky as we think we are. Um,
Yeah. Well, Yugoslavia is a sign of that, right? Nazi Germany. Like all the genocides are really stories of that for us because Yugoslavia was a culture of the Slavs. They came together as Slavic nations of people who had been oppressed, right? Even the term slave comes from Slav, right? They've been people who've been oppressed for centuries, millennia. They come together, they form a country. There was no division. There was no animosity. They loved each other. They were neighbors. It was a utopia. Things were going very well for them. They were being oppressed from the outside, but they held together as a people, right? And then all of a sudden, some propaganda starts getting out. You can't trust the Serbs. And the other side, you can't trust the Croatians. They really want to kill us. And with political manipulation, it turned neighbor against neighbor, right? And it led to the creation of this genocide. And there were stories that while we were there of guys who would be taxi drivers during the week. And on the weekends, they'd go on up and be volunteer army officers in the revolution. And they'd go up and they'd kill, they'd burn, they'd rape, they would steal. They'd come back with a TV and a new TV from a house that somebody that killed everybody, and then they stole their TV and came back. And on Monday they were a taxi driver again, right? These are our everyday neighbors. That how could you how could you be a family man with a family? You're a taxi driver, and on Saturday you go and murder and rape and burn and steal. But we think we're beyond it. But
yeah,
the Yugoslavians were not beyond it, and they're not different than us, right? We think we're beyond it, but I'm not sure we are, right? How did it happen in Rwanda, right? These are neighbors. Like how they're not disformed people, they're just people, right? Which means we are them and they are us. It didn't take much, right? Some distrust, right? They're the ones that are the problem. And before you know it, blood in the street, right? How did the Jewish people, right? How did they see the Jews as, less than 1% of the population of Germany? How did they become the ones that were the cause of all their problems? Somebody, less than 1% of the population. You would think rational people would never do that, right? And after World War II and Nazi Germany, we thought we would never do that again, right? That was done, right? And then Yugoslavia, right? So then we set up the ICTY. Okay, well, we'll do one more court, right? One more court, and then Rwanda, right? Right, it is not, if anything, the genocide is more exponential than it was before. So, like, what are we, right? What are this goes even back to in philosophy, people like Thomas Hobbes. After the killing of King James the First in England, he's walking through the streets of England and he's seeing a farmer being hung from the tree. There's dead bodies in the road, and he thinks, "Is it? Is this better than under King James the First? Is this better?" Right? So Hobbes argues that we need to have a very uh, strong society because human nature being what it is, we can resort to violent chaos at a drop of the hat. He thinks that's part of our human nature, which history hasn't proven him wrong,
Right.
unfortunately, right? So, uh,
Yeah. Here's a tough question. You're bringing that up, and I think it leads to something interesting. So one of the things that I cover in my, content is, um, because I'm not, saying get rid of all police are bad, or all judges are bad, or anything like that, right? It's if you really listen to my content, there's some bad judges, bad police officers. We got to fix this. And but in addition to that, what something that connects back to what you're talking about right there is talk about how the criminal justice system here in the United States is unfair. It does not represent what it was intended to be. It's not,
mhm,
the whole innocent until proven guilty is a joke for in so many ways, right? Because it's not really that way for most people. And that's a whole conversation topic. But one of the things that connects back to what you just said is I try to tell people, look, understand, like the criminal justice system is not fair, not just to, Black people or Hispanic people or minorities of other, other types, right? It's not fair for anyone. Like the
mhm,
whole system is messed up for, against everybody. And one of the things that that I like to point out, right? And I haven't done too much content on this, but it's like right now, what's going on right now in the United States, or all the division that's going on.
mhm,
Um, I mean, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I could be completely wrong, but I'll tell you, like, I think it's all orchestrated, right?
mhm,
Because the powers that be, right, to them, it benefits them if they create a civil war, if they create conflict amongst us, whether it's north
mhm,
and south, east and west, black and white, Christian and Muslim,
mhm,
LDS and Catholic, whatever it is, right? There's so many
mhm,
different divisions. They benefit from it because at this point, with AI and all the technology that we have, right, at our disposal, the powers that be really don't need. They don't need a population of 330 million to run this country successfully and for them to be happy and successful and make a ton of money, right? It's
mhm,
AI is starting to replace tons of jobs already, and I mean, and it's just going to continue exponentially to grow. So it seems almost like they're provoking in some ways, right, through the media, through movies, and they're almost like provoking that to happen here in the U.S. And there's some pretty intelligent people that are talking about this, right? This is not a conspiracy theory. There's very intelligent people, very well-known podcasts, and there's just a handful of them that I've come across, and I'm sure there's more that are talking about this, right? And
mhm.
but I'd love to get your thoughts on that because what are the chances that we could have a Rwanda here in the United States or Yugoslavia type situation, right? It's yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about the Civil War, right? The great divorce of America. Yeah, could America evolve into a civil war? I think so. I think it could, right? The thing that I think that keeps us from it is it's not really North versus South. It tends to be rural versus cities, I think, right? Like I live in rural Maine and it's very conservative. And if you get to the cities in Maine, they're very liberal, right? And I think the same with like Boston, very liberal. You go out west in Massachusetts, very conservative. Even Rhode Island, Providence, very liberal. Get out to the so the division isn't North versus South, but there is certainly a division of city versus rural in America. And I think, yeah, people are on edge. And I did an interview with Fox News not long ago on the Civil War, and you know they what they love to like prime up and get in people's minds is you got to prep, you got to get materials for the Civil War, you better get some guns in case there's a Civil War. But my lesson from the working with the UN is just life, I guess, would be the most important thing if there were a civil war is that you don't lose yourself. Like you don't become the Nazi. You don't become the guy who gets in his car and steals people's TVs and murders people on the way. Like that's the danger. Not to say I want to be murdered, but I would much rather be murdered by a Nazi than to become a Nazi. Like if it came down to it, like if it came down to like murdering my neighbor who's trying to steal food or being murdered, I'd rather be murdered in a
Yeah.
sense because I wouldn't want to lose myself. And I'm not sure that that's argued enough because we're often these types of people who think, well, if they're going to get me, I'm going to get them first. And that's exactly how you create a civil war, right? That's actually what happened in Yugoslavia, right? It was the Croatians saying, it's the Serbians who are going to kill us, so we better kill them first. And the Serbians were saying, we got to kill the Croatians because if we don't, they're going to kill us first, right? This is how the politicians divided the people was to pros the other side as enemies and we need to be preemptive, right? We had to be preemptive was the plan. But this, uh, not to blame everything on communism, but it is a bit of the Marxist playbook, right? Marx wanted the nation to eventually break the system so that you could recreate a communist nation, right? And he thinks it's going to happen eventually, but it's not happening fast enough. So what do you want to do? You need to stoke the divisions, right? The more you can stoke the divisions, the faster you'll bring on the revolution. Right. So it's everything is seen through the lens of the oppressor and the oppressed. It's black versus white, it's men versus women, it's native versus immigrant, right? It's all of the division. Um, right? You just stoke it, right? If you can make people anti-white, that's good. If you can make people anti-black, that's even better, right? Drive the division so it will bring us to the revolution. I don't think most people are consciously Marxist, but I think they have unintentionally absorbed some of it. I think they've absorbed it thinking, I don't like the status quo, so let's bring on the next thing. But the next thing is usually bloodshed. Right? The next thing is usually not utopia because utopia is not for this world, right? The next thing will be bloodshed with the idea that after the blood has been shed, then there will be peace. But we get the bloodshed, but we never get the peace. Right? That's the pattern over and over again. I don't know.
Yeah, no, no, it's unfortunate, but that's the, that's, and what are your thoughts on whether or not this is being orchestrated, right? Like, do you believe that that is the case, or do you think this is just kind of the natural progression of things?
I think there is a matter of orchestration, right? Even when Marx, when he writes about this in the Communist Manifesto, there's always the academics and the elites who side themselves with the proletariat, who say, well, I'm not one of the bad rich people. I'm one of the good rich people. I'm one of the good ones, right? Who really, they put on the garb of the communists and charge forward. And I think you see this type of virtue signaling with our own politicians and within our own celebrity class of people, where I'm not one of the bad ones. I'm one of the good ones. But
Yeah,
I'm not sure that they're not necessarily genuine.
sure.
Right? It's just popular. It just makes you popular, but it doesn't really make you genuine. And revolution is never good for the poor, right? It's not the solution is violent solution. We want to evolve to a better place, right? We should be constantly reforming, doing better, but it's not to tear down the entire system, I don't think.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree with you completely. I agree with you completely. So Jake, if you don't mind, I'd love to be able to jump into shift gears.
Sure.
Kind of a heavy topic. We'll go into something a little bit different. You're very driven, right? You've done some pretty amazing things. We've talked about some of them. We've not talked about everything, but you've done some pretty amazing things with your life. You're very driven. What is your jet fuel? I mean, what is it that you're running from, and what is it that you're chasing?
The truth. That's all I want is the truth.
Elaborate.
Uh,
What do you mean by that?
what's that?
Could you elaborate? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I'm in academia. I really want to know what is true, right? And it's not my truth or your truth or relative truth. I want to know the truth. And that also means that my understanding of the world is not necessarily the truth, right? My worldview is fine, but it's not the truth, right? Because it's a process and a journey to understand the truth, right? Which means you have to kill your own idols and you have to be willing to sacrifice and realize sometimes you're wrong. But I think life is should be in pursuit of the truth. And when you get to the truth, with that is goodness and beauty and unity. As a Catholic, I care about those transcendental ideas of goodness, truth, and beauty. Um, but I think life is about the pursuit of the truth, and that's the thing that keeps me going, and that you'd pay any price for the truth as well, right? If my college ever were to fire me because I wasn't pursuing the truth, I'll be fired, right? It doesn't matter because the truth is all that matters, not anything else.
Could you give me three areas where you're pursuing the truth? Like three areas?
Yeah, yeah. One of them was the transgender issue was a very interesting one to me philosophically and in terms of human nature. So I wrote a book about that in 2020, which got published in 2021. But I wanted to know the truth on the transgender issue because so much was being said on it. So I read every scientific study that was done. I read every book by every transgender writer. I read everything that had to do with the contradiction. And then when I wrote my book, I tried to synthesize everybody's idea in a cohesive way that respected everyone, but it kind of walked through it. None of my own opinion is in the book. It's like 800 pages long, and none of it has my opinion in it. I'm just navigating through all of the different areas of the topic. Um, and trying to uncover, well, what is the truth, right? um and I'm not transgender and I don't have a horse in the game, right? I don't have anything against it or for it. I just want to know what the truth is, right? That's the only thing that matters to me. um which upsets people on both sides because we are very ideologically driven, right? There's people who are very conservative might want me to say something really strong against the transgender, and people want me to be say something very strong against the conservative. But I think to be in the truth is to be honest, right, with what what we know and what we don't know. So that's one area um, that's very important. I also think in terms of as a teacher, I want to train students in also pursuing the truth, right? So a lot of times we go back to original documents to find out where do all of our ideas come from, right? We might think, well, I'm an original person with original thoughts, but really there are no such thing as original thoughts anymore, right? You probably will find that a lot of what you think was said by the Stoics. It was said by the Epicureans. It was said by the pre-Socratics and the Socratics and the Aristotelians, the medievals. We are usually an evolution of many ideas with very ancient origins. And if we can kind of understand where we get our ideas from, we can, I don't know, maybe be more conscious of what we believe and why we believe what we believe. We can also learn from history, right? So I'm, again, a bit more of an Aristotelian who's more of a realist, right? Versus Plato, who comes up with an ideal republic society, who's living in a utopia vision of what society will be. Aristotle's more based in reality. I think there's wisdom in understanding these ideologies, right? If you're going to buy into the Platonic view of the world, it comes with consequences, right? Again, the communists have copied the Platonic view of the world, and what is the consequence? Um, so I think it's important to, in the pursuit of the truth, follow back to the origins of things and to continue to ask questions, right? A lot of my assignments to my students, we go through all different types of issues of culture and society, and then I give them issues, and it says even things like the gender pay gap, is it real? Pursue the truth, right? Do the research. What don't just take what Donald Trump said, or Nancy Pelosi said, or Barack Obama said. What is the truth, right? Dig down and find the facts, right? Because that's what matters is the truth, right? And a lot of students have a hard time doing it, right? They like grabbing people's conclusions. And it's like, well, I like the person, so I'm going to take their conclusion, but that's not a good approach, right? What is the truth, though? What is the why does that person come to that conclusion? Look at the evidence, right? I think that's really important to do that.
Yeah. I wonder how you wrestle with and how you manage, right, your pursuit of truth in areas where because there's a lot of those, right? I love philosophy myself. I didn't study it like you have and become a professor, but I really have enjoyed it since a very young age. But there's some things where the truth, I mean, is there ever a really truly an objective truth? How do you handle, how do you wrestle with that? Because and maybe you can give us an example of one of those, because I think you know what I mean, right? There's some things where, I mean, what is the truth, right? Some things are
Mhm.
not, there is no truth. It's always subjective. It's always up for interpretation and yeah.
Yeah, yeah, especially the younger generation, there's always like everybody's a relativist, right? Everyone's a subjectivist. There is no such thing as truth, there is no such thing as goodness, there is no such thing as beauty. It's all in the eye of the beholder. I really fight against that a lot with the students. I try to challenge them beyond the relativism because again, if there is no truth, right? And I'm not saying I know what the truth is, right? To me, it's the truth is a journey, not something for this world, right? In some sense, it's not for this world, but nobody has it. Nobody has it in its entirety, right? But if you don't pursue some of these deeper and truer things, you can be very easily manipulated, right? And I think that's the challenge is, when and it's not to pick any type of political side, but it's like when Donald Trump is your hero, he's the solution, then anything he says is true. And if Joe Biden is your savior, then everything he says is true. But we know that truth is not simply what the Democratic Party says or the Republican Party says. There is a truth, though, right? I think there is a truth, but it's not going to be something that people just kind of hand it over to you, right? Like even difficult things like the abortion issue, like people get very ideological about these issues and they don't care about the truth, right? If versus if we were really pursuing the truth, we would be very uncomfortably in the middle with a lot of issues, right? And I think um I don't know if that's an answer, but I think part of it is that you really do need to struggle with an idea of the truth, I think. I think that there is the truth out there. And the good as well. The good is something that has been entirely abandoned, is the good either. Like if good is just whatever is good for me or whatever makes me feel good, right? This is utilitarianism. Just good is whatever makes me feel good. Um, I don't believe that. I believe that there is objectively good and bad things in the world, right? Murdering innocent people, objectively bad, not just bad in my mind, but objectively bad. Sexual abuse, abusing children, they are objectively wrong, right? It's not wrong in my mind, right in somebody else's mind. I challenge some students who come from other parts of the world, right? If your culture says it's okay to marry a 5-year-old girl, is that right? Objectively, no. No, because it doesn't respect the human dignity of that person, right? Which is the truth,
Right.
which is good. Um, but your culture might say it's perfectly okay to marry a 5-year-old girl, right? I think, again, it doesn't mean American culture has all of the answers and that it's right and it's always good, but we have to be in the pursuit of what is true and what is good, I think.
Yeah. I'll agree with you on the fact that we should pursue truth. As far as objective truth, I have to leave that for another podcast because you gave so many examples, and I can think of so many examples to counter it, and so many ways to
Sure.
challenge some of those things because um, it gets so deep, right? But that's, I think, it'd be awesome to have you here on, another podcast and discuss good and bad, right? And truth
Mhm.
and ethics and that would be a fascinating conversation. But I don't want to take up your whole day. So,
We can do it. We can do it again sometime. We no problem. Yeah, the question of truth and the question of goodness and evil, right? Yeah,
yeah,
but those are the most important. Those are some of the most important questions in life, right? In
yeah,
some ways, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask just three last questions, if I may.
Sure.
So one of them is I'd love to know what it is that you do every day that makes you happy.
Well, I pray my rosary every day. And that gives me a sense of purpose and structure throughout my day. I do my four rosaries a day, and I read books. That gives me a lot of joy in life. Um, and just be grateful, right? I know that's not a great list of things, but
It is. It is.
simplicity.
All three of them were wonderful. I mean, yeah, the last one that you didn't elaborate on, gratitude, that's incredibly important, right? They've done studies on that. It's incredibly
Right.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I have no depression. No, I see all the students so depressed and anxious all the time. I think I don't even understand it.
Yeah.
Like I just don't get it. I don't have time for that.
Right.
Mm, mm.
The next question, where do you see yourself in 10 years?
Wherever God puts me. I think people make plans and God laughs. So my philosophy in life has been to say yes to whatever's presented in front of me, and you never know where that might bring you. So just keep saying yes to wherever opportunities come in front of me, and you know, wherever God puts me, that's where I'll be, right? So
I
that's
love
that's all.
it. I love it. And the last question, if today was your last day on earth, right? Today's your last day. What three
Mm.
things would you want to be remembered by? And I mean, your children, right? Generations that will someday read about you, people that don't know you, right? Because this video recording here, this podcast is going to survive, your life, right? You'll pass away, and this will
Mhm.
still be out there. But what three things would you want to be remembered by if today was your last day?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I've given it some thought because you sent me the questions ahead of time, so I had some chance to reflect on it. And I still don't know if I have a good answer for you because for me, it doesn't matter. Not to say that I am nothing, but it, I intend to leave no legacy. I tend to have no followers. I intend to, maybe part of my happiness is not trying to become something. Is I think that there's a peace in the poverty and the of life and the simplicity of life. I nearly never post on social media or anything like I just don't have any interest of being followed. But it comes with a tremendous amount of peace. Um,
Maybe we
yeah,
can narrow the question down. I mean, your children, right? You have how many children do you have?
I raised three foster children for different periods of their lives. Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
What,
I hope I'm remembered by them. Not to
what,
go down this road, but my youngest one I had from the time he was born until 14 months, and then he was able to go back with his biological family. So in some ways, he probably won't remember me as he gets older. Like I'll never forget him. But like because I raised him for the first 14 months of his life, but in some ways I will be forgotten. And but
yeah,
I sometimes I think of like when we're both in heaven, like we'll be like, I remember you. maybe, maybe something like that. I don't know.
yeah. So nothing specific character traits, maybe being a truth seeker, being honest, having integrity, hard worker, helping others, nothing like that. Nothing.
No, I'm not. I'm not the best at any of them. I am a moderately truth seeker. I'm a moderately generous person. I'm a moderately nice person. I, I hope someday to be a saint, but not one that's canonized and celebrated. But
Yeah,
when when God asked Thomas Aquinas, he went to Thomas Aquinas, he said, "You have written well of me. What would you like?" And Thomas Aquinas' response was, "Non nisi te domine." Only you, God. Right? Only you, God. That's all I need. So, you know, I know
Okay,
it comes off as a very religious perspective, but um,
I like
I
it
think
though.
that there's a tremendous joy in the simplicity of things like faith and justice and truth and goodness and sitting outside on a warm day and having a cold glass of water with a friend. I think that's really what life is more about than any type of legacy that I might leave. So,
Yeah. No, I love that. That's a great answer. Thank you. So if people wanted to get a hold of you, I know you have a couple of nonprofits, right? You're building a school. You're also raising money for scholarships for students in Haiti. How can they get a hold of you?
yeah, if you want to if you want to help people in Haiti, and if you've been, that's a whole nother podcast itself with what's going on in Haiti right now, right? But um, for the last few years, we've been providing about 150 student scholarships to go to school because in Haiti, students don't get to go to school for free in public school. You have to pay to go to school, and I've been helping this little village on the island of La Gonave off of Port-au-Prince. So if you would like to get involved with that, if you I don't have a website and all these things, but if you go onto Facebook and look up the Pierre Toussaint Society, you can see what we posted there and contact me. If you go on to LinkedIn, Jacob Thibault, Jakob Thibault, Thibault, connect with me there. I'm happy to um help you. It's not the stuff I do, it doesn't have a lot of bureaucracy. People give money and we send money to the schools and they put kids in schools and there's no middleman or bureaucracy involved. It's just direct to helping people. Although this is a particular time where they need a lot of help with the collapse of the government right now.
Yeah, awesome. Well,
Yeah.
Jake, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining me today. It's been amazing. I would love to have a follow-up podcast. I think there's a lot of interesting topics that we didn't get to really dive deep into, and if you're open to that, I'd love to have you again.
Anytime, anytime. Certainly.
Awesome.
Thank you, Ramon.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.